May 3, 1942, 11:47 p.m. Station HYPO, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The air in the basement of the 14th Naval District Administration building tastes of cigarette smoke and stale coffee. Technical Sergeant Joseph Rochefort sits hunched over a radio receiver, headphones pressed against his ears, listening to the static-laced voice of the Pacific, encrypted Japanese naval transmissions that arrive in bursts of sound, incomprehensible to anyone lacking the mathematical keys to decode them. The room is cramped, lit by harsh fluorescent tubes that cast no shadows, only a flat, exhausting brightness that makes time feel suspended. Around Rochefort, 23 cryptanalysts and radio operators work at desks crowded with papers, punch cards, and mechanical calculators. The sound is constant, the clatter of typewriters, the clicking of cipher machines, the low murmur of men discussing code patterns in voices dulled by exhaustion. Outside, somewhere above this underground warren, Pearl Harbor continues its painful recovery from the December 7th attack that shattered the Pacific Fleet and killed over 2,000 American servicemen. Down here, in this windowless space, another kind of war is being fought, a war of signals and patterns, of cryptographic systems and the minds trying to break them. The radio receiver before Rochefort is standard Navy equipment, a RCA AR-88 communications receiver capable of tuning the high-frequency bands where Japanese naval transmissions cluster. It is a sophisticated instrument for its time, stable and sensitive, but it possesses a critical limitation: it can only receive one frequency at a time. To monitor Japanese naval communications, which occur across multiple frequencies simultaneously, requires multiple receivers and multiple operators, each listening to a single channel, each transcribing transmissions by hand for later analysis. This process is slow, inefficient, and incomplete. Important transmissions are missed because no one was listening to that particular frequency at that particular moment. Patterns that might reveal Japanese operational plans remain invisible because the data arrives fragmented across time and channels. Rochefort understands this problem with crystalline clarity. He has been fighting it for months, watching his team struggle to intercept enough raw transmission data to feed the cryptanalytic process. Breaking the Japanese naval code, designated JN-25 by American intelligence, requires vast quantities of intercepted messages. Each message provides clues, repeated phrases that might indicate standard procedures, code groups that appear in predictable contexts, patterns in transmission schedules that suggest operational tempo. But gathering this data requires listening constantly across dozens of frequencies, and Station HYPO does not have dozens of operators to spare. The mathematics of cryptanalysis are unforgiving. Insufficient data means unsolved codes, and unsolved codes mean American commanders fight blind while Japanese admirals know exactly where to strike. The problem is not merely academic. In the 5 months since Pearl Harbor, the Japanese have achieved an unbroken string of victories: the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma. Their carriers roam the Pacific with apparent impunity, striking targets from Ceylon to Australia. American forces, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, retreat steadily while Washington struggles to develop a coherent strategy for fighting back. The only advantage the Americans possess is cryptography, the possibility that Japanese codes might be broken and their plans revealed. But possibility is not certainty, and time is running out. Intelligence reports suggest the Japanese are planning a major operation, something beyond the raids and invasions that have characterized their offensive thus far. But where, when, with what forces? Station HYPO's cryptanalysts work 18-hour days trying to answer these questions, and they are failing because they cannot intercept enough messages to see the pattern. Rochefort removes his headphones and stares at the receiver. He is 39 years old, a career naval officer who stumbled into cryptanalysis through linguistic aptitude rather than mathematical training. He studied Japanese in Tokyo before the war, understands the language with near-native fluency, and possesses an intuitive grasp of how Japanese military culture structures communication. But intuition is useless without data, and data requires interception. The receiver before him, for all its sophistication, can only listen to one conversation at a time in a room where dozens are happening simultaneously. What Rochefort needs is a receiver that can monitor multiple frequencies at once, that can scan automatically across the spectrum where Japanese transmissions occur, that can capture everything rather than forcing operators to guess which channel might carry important traffic. Such a receiver does not exist in the Navy's inventory. The technology required, automatic frequency scanning, synchronized recording, rapid channel switching, is theoretically possible, but has never been implemented in operational equipment. And even if it could be built, the official channels through which new equipment is developed and deployed move at peacetime speeds measured in years, not the wartime weeks that current circumstances demand. Rochefort stands, stretches muscles cramped from hours at the desk, and walks to the workshop area at the far end of the basement. Here, scattered across wooden benches, lies a collection of radio components, vacuum tubes, capacitors, transformers, wire and chassis stripped from damaged equipment. The workshop is unofficial, unauthorized, maintained by operators who repair equipment when formal maintenance channels prove too slow. Rochefort has been coming here late at night, after his regular shift, examining components and considering possibilities. He is not an electrical engineer, his expertise lies in language and cryptanalysis, not circuit design, but he understands radio theory, has read technical manuals out of curiosity, and possesses the kind of mind that sees problems as puzzles rather than obstacles. The modification he envisions is conceptually straightforward but practically daunting. Alter the RCA receiver's tuning circuit to scan automatically across a predetermined range of frequencies, dwelling briefly on each before moving to the next, while simultaneously recording the audio output to capture any transmissions encountered during the scan. The scanning mechanism would require motorizing the receiver's tuning capacitor, adding timing circuits to control scan speed, and integrating a recording system, probably wire recorders, which are available in limited quantities for voice transcription. The entire system would need to operate reliably over extended periods, scanning continuously, capturing everything, creating a complete record of Japanese naval communications across all monitored frequencies. The technical challenges are substantial. Motorizing the tuning capacitor risks introducing mechanical instability that degrades receiver sensitivity. The scanning speed must be fast enough to cover all frequencies regularly, but slow enough to detect transmissions reliably. The recording system must activate instantly when a signal is detected and must handle multiple activations per minute without failing, and the entire modification must be accomplished using only the parts available in this basement workshop, with hand tools and improvised fabrication techniques, because requesting parts through official channels would take months and would require explaining a modification that violates Navy equipment regulations. Rochefort picks up a small electric motor, salvaged from a damaged ventilation fan, and examines it thoughtfully. This could drive the tuning capacitor, if properly geared. The timing circuits could be built using surplus relay components from telephone switching equipment. The recording activation could be triggered by a simple signal detection circuit. When audio amplitude exceeds a threshold, start recording. None of these individual elements are revolutionary, but combined into a functioning system, they would create something the Navy does not possess, an automatic multi-frequency surveillance capability that could transform cryptanalytic operations. The development of modern signals intelligence, the systematic interception, analysis and exploitation of enemy communications, was in 1942 barely a generation old. During World War I, both sides had discovered that radio communications, while offering unprecedented command and control capabilities, also exposed operational plans to anyone who could intercept the signals. The British breaking of German diplomatic codes had helped bring America into the war. The Germans had broken Russian codes with devastating effect on the Eastern Front. The lessons were clear: encrypted communications were vulnerable, cryptanalysis was possible, and the side that read its enemies' messages possessed overwhelming advantages. Between the wars, the United States had maintained modest cryptanalytic efforts, concentrated in the Army's Signal Intelligence Service and the Navy's OP-20G Communications Security Section. These organizations were small, chronically underfunded, staffed by a handful of linguists and mathematicians who worked in obscurity on problems that seemed academic to peacetime commanders more concerned with budgets and political constraints. The Japanese, meanwhile, had developed increasingly sophisticated codes for their naval communications, recognizing that any future Pacific War would involve dispersed fleets coordinating over vast distances through radio. The Japanese Navy's JN-25 code was a formidable system, a two-part code, where common words and phrases were represented by 5-digit numbers, which were then further encrypted by adding 5-digit additive numbers from codebooks. Breaking this system required identifying the meanings of thousands of code groups, discovering the additive tables, and doing so without physical access to Japanese codebooks or cipher keys. It was a mathematical and linguistic puzzle of enormous complexity, solvable only through the analysis of vast numbers of intercepted messages that provided enough context and repetition to reveal patterns. Station HYPO, officially the Combat Intelligence Unit supporting the Pacific Fleet, had been working on JN-25 since before Pearl Harbor. By May 1942, they had achieved partial success, able to read perhaps 15 to 20% of intercepted messages, enough to reveal fragments of Japanese plans, but not enough to provide complete intelligence. The fundamental problem was volume. Cryptanalysis required analyzing hundreds of messages daily to track changes in additive tables, to identify new code groups, to maintain currency as the Japanese periodically updated their systems. But HYPO could only intercept a fraction of the messages being transmitted, because their monitoring capability was limited by the number of receivers and operators available. Rochefort had been arguing for months that the interception problem was more critical than the analysis problem. His team included brilliant cryptanalysts, men like Jasper Holmes and Ham Wright, who could perform cryptographic miracles when given sufficient data. But data was the constraint. Japanese transmissions occurred at unpredictable times across 24 high-frequency channels. Missing a single important message might mean failing to identify a critical operation, and messages were being missed daily, hourly, because human operators could not monitor all channels simultaneously, and could not remain alert through round-the-clock shifts without degrading performance. The official Navy response to this problem was to request more personnel, more receivers, more resources, requests that moved through bureaucratic channels with agonizing slowness, while Japanese carriers struck Allied positions with depressing regularity. Rochefort understood that official channels would not solve the problem quickly enough. The major Japanese operation that intelligence fragments suggested was imminent, something involving extensive carrier operations, possibly an invasion, certainly a strategic gambit of some kind, would occur weeks or months before additional resources arrived. If HYPO was going to provide warning, it would have to do so with existing equipment, modified to perform beyond its intended capabilities. Rochefort began the modification work on the night of May 3rd, and continued through 4 consecutive nights, sleeping in brief snatches at his desk, existing on coffee and the benzodrine tablets that had become ubiquitous among HYPO's overworked staff. He worked largely alone, assisted occasionally by a young radio man named Thomas Huckins, who possessed an intuitive understanding of electronics, and who asked no questions about whether this modification had been authorized. The first challenge was mechanical, creating a motorized drive system for the receiver's tuning capacitor that would scan smoothly across frequencies without introducing vibration or instability. Rochefort and Huckins fabricated a gear reduction system using brass stock cut and filed by hand, connecting the salvaged motor to the tuning shaft through a series of reducing gears that slowed the motor's rotation to a speed suitable for frequency scanning. The motor was powered by a voltage-controlled circuit that allowed adjusting scan speed. Faster scanning covered more frequencies per minute, but risked missing brief transmissions, while slower scanning was more thorough, but left larger time gaps between visits to any particular frequency. The timing and control circuits were built using telephone relays and basic electronic components. Rochefort designed a simple but effective scanning pattern. The receiver would sweep continuously from 4 MHz to 18 MHz, the high-frequency band where Japanese naval transmissions clustered, pausing for 3 seconds at each frequency before stepping upward. A complete scan cycle took approximately 14 minutes, meaning any given frequency was monitored roughly 4 times per hour. This was far from continuous monitoring, but it was dramatically better than the previous system where some frequencies might go unmonitored for hours or days. The recording system proved most challenging. Wire recorders, devices that captured audio by magnetizing thin steel wire, were available but finicky. The wire tended to tangle or break, recording quality degraded over time, and the mechanism required frequent maintenance. Worse, HYPO possessed only 3 functioning wire recorders, insufficient to record all frequencies simultaneously even with the scanning system. Rochefort's solution was elegant. Rather than recording continuously, the system would activate recording only when a transmission was detected. A signal strength detector circuit monitored the receiver's audio output. When amplitude exceeded a threshold indicating an active transmission, a relay would close, starting the wire recorder and simultaneously noting the frequency on a mechanical counter. The recorder would capture the transmission, then stop automatically when the signal ended, ready for the next activation. The entire system was assembled on a makeshift rack built from angle iron and plywood. It looked, in Huckin's later description, like something a ham radio operator would build in his garage, wires everywhere, components mounted wherever they fit, the whole thing held together with solder and hope. It violated every principle of military equipment design. It was not standardized, not documented, not approved, not tested through formal evaluation procedures. It was also, when Rochefort powered it on at 2:30 a.m. on May 8, exactly what Station HYPO needed. The modified receiver began scanning at 2:34 a.m., its motorized tuning mechanism producing a soft, rhythmic clicking as it stepped across frequencies. The wire recorder activated 17 times in the first hour. 17 Japanese transmissions captured automatically that would have been missed by human operators who could not monitor all frequencies simultaneously. By dawn, the system had recorded 43 transmissions, providing HYPO's cryptanalysts with more raw data from a single night than they typically obtained in 3 days of conventional monitoring. Rochefort recognized immediately that the modification had transformed their operational capability. The volume of intercepted traffic increased by a factor of 5 within the first week. More importantly, the automatic scanning captured transmissions that human operators would have missed, brief messages sent during off hours, frequency changes that scattered related messages across the spectrum, coordination between multiple Japanese commands that used different channels. The cryptanalysts, suddenly drowning in data after months of scarcity, began identifying patterns that had been invisible when working from incomplete intercepts. By May 15, Station HYPO had intercepted and partially decrypted messages that revealed the broad outlines of the Japanese operation that intelligence had been tracking: a major carrier strike combined with an invasion, targeting a location designated by the code letters AF. But what was AF? Cryptanalysts had identified it as a geographic location, clearly important, but the code group's meaning remained unclear. Some analysts believed AF referred to the Aleutian Islands, others argued for Midway Atoll, still others suggested targets in the South Pacific or even Hawaii itself. The debate was not academic. The Pacific Fleet, still recovering from Pearl Harbor's devastation, could not defend everywhere simultaneously. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding from his headquarters above Station HYPO, needed to know where to position his 3 available carriers to intercept the Japanese force. Guessing wrong meant American carriers would be out of position when the Japanese struck, potentially losing not just the immediate battle, but America's ability to project naval power in the Pacific for years. Rochefort was convinced that AF meant Midway, a small atoll roughly 1,100 miles northwest of Hawaii, strategically positioned to threaten Japanese supply lines and to serve as a base for American air operations. His conviction was based partly on cryptanalytic evidence and partly on intuition born from his understanding of Japanese strategic thinking. But conviction was not proof, and Nimitz needed certainty before committing his carriers to what would be the Pacific War's first major fleet engagement. The modified receiver provided the key to confirming AF's identity. On May 19, The system intercepted a Japanese message that mentioned AF in connection with a water shortage. This was useful but not definitive. Many islands faced water issues. Rochefort proposed a deception operation, have Midway transmit an uncoded message reporting freshwater distillation equipment failure. If the Japanese intercepted this message and subsequently reported that AF had water problems, it would prove AF was Midway. The deception was implemented on May 22. Midway sent its uncoded message. 2 days later, the modified receiver captured a Japanese transmission reporting that AF was experiencing freshwater shortages. The identification was confirmed. Nimitz ordered his carriers to positions northeast of Midway and prepared for battle. The Battle of Midway, fought June 4–7, 1942, resulted in the destruction of 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the death of over 3,000 Japanese sailors and aircrew, and the permanent shift of strategic initiative in the Pacific War. Japanese naval aviation, which had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, never recovered from the losses. American forces, emboldened by victory, began the long offensive that would end 3 years later with Japan's surrender. The battle's outcome depended on many factors: the courage of American pilots, tactical decisions by commanders on both sides, luck both good and bad. But the fundamental prerequisite was intelligence, knowing that the Japanese were coming, knowing where they would strike, knowing their force composition well enough to position American carriers for an ambush. That knowledge came from Station HYPO's cryptanalysts, working from intercepts that Rochefort's modified receiver had captured. Japanese naval records, examined after the war, revealed how completely American intelligence had penetrated their plans. The operational orders for Midway had been transmitted in what Japanese commanders believed was an unbreakable code across multiple frequencies at various times. American operators, they assumed, could not possibly monitor all frequencies continuously, and therefore would miss crucial messages. This assumption was correct until May 8, 1942. After that date, the modified scanning receiver captured Japanese transmissions with near completeness, providing cryptanalysts the volume of data they needed to break the code and reconstruct Japanese plans in detail. A captured Japanese naval intelligence officer, interrogated in 1943, expressed bewilderment at American cryptanalytic success. "We changed frequencies regularly, transmitted at unpredictable times, used multiple channels to fragment our communications. By all logic, the Americans should have intercepted only a fraction of our messages, insufficient for code breaking. How did they capture everything?" The answer, which American interrogators did not provide, was that a sergeant working in a basement workshop had built a device that made continuous multi-frequency monitoring possible, using modified equipment and improvised components. For the American cryptanalysts at Station HYPO, the experience was psychologically transformative. They had spent months feeling inadequate, watching their incomplete intercepts produce incomplete intelligence, while Japanese forces won victory after victory. The modified receiver changed this. Suddenly they possessed the data they needed. Code groups that had been mysterious became clear. Japanese operational patterns emerged from static. The cryptanalysts went from feeling like they were fighting with one hand tied to feeling empowered, confident, capable of providing intelligence that saved lives and won battles. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, Pacific Fleet Intelligence Officer, later wrote about this transformation. "Before May 1942, we were guessing, inferring, hoping our fragmentary intelligence was accurate. After Rochefort's modification, we were reading Japanese mail. The psychological impact on our team was extraordinary. We went from defensive uncertainty to offensive confidence. This confidence permeated upward through the command structure. Admiral Nimitz, trusting HYPO's intelligence, made decisions that would have been unconscionably risky without solid cryptanalytic foundation. The modified receiver had not only intercepted messages, it had transformed the psychological balance of the Pacific War. The clicking sound of the motorized tuning mechanism became, for HYPO's staff, the sound of capability restored, the sound of American technical ingenuity solving a problem that official channels had been unable to address. It was a modest sound, mechanical and repetitive, utterly unlike the thunder of naval guns or the roar of aircraft engines. But to the men who worked in that windowless basement, that clicking was the sound of the war turning, of momentum shifting, of American forces finally gaining the advantage that cryptographic intelligence could provide. This sound carried symbolic weight beyond its functional purpose. It represented the democratic principle that solutions could come from anywhere, that a sergeant working with hand tools could solve problems that baffled procurement bureaucracies, that authority should enable rather than constrain innovation. The Navy's official equipment development process, designed for peacetime efficiency and standardization, had failed to produce the multi-frequency monitoring capability that operations demanded. Rochefort, operating outside official channels, had built it in 5 days using salvaged parts. The contrast with Japanese operational culture was stark. The Japanese Navy possessed excellent cryptographers, sophisticated code systems, and capable intelligence personnel. But Japanese military culture emphasized discipline, hierarchy, and adherence to established procedures. A Japanese sergeant who conceived an unauthorized equipment modification would likely face punishment rather than commendation. Innovation was expected to flow downward from technical bureaus and staff officers, not upward from enlisted personnel. This rigid structure produced operational efficiency when plans succeeded but struggled to adapt when circumstances required improvisation. American military culture, reflecting the society that produced it, was more fluid. Authority existed but was less absolute. Regulations existed but could be circumvented when mission requirements demanded. Junior personnel who solved problems were celebrated rather than disciplined, even when their methods violated formal procedures. This flexibility created inefficiencies and occasionally chaos, but it also created an environment where innovation could occur rapidly at the tactical level, where good ideas could be implemented immediately rather than waiting for bureaucratic approval. Rochefort's modification exemplified this cultural difference. He had not requested permission to modify Navy equipment, because permission would have been denied or delayed. He had simply done what the situation required, trusting that results would justify methods. His superiors, when they learned of the modification, which was immediately since the sudden increase in intercept volume was impossible to hide, validated this trust. Rather than disciplining Rochefort for unauthorized equipment modification, they authorized expanding the system, building additional modified receivers, and eventually standardizing the modification across other Navy intercept stations. The clicking of the scanning receiver continued day and night through the summer and autumn of 1942, as American forces transitioned from defense to offense. Station HYPO expanded, moving to larger facilities, receiving more personnel and equipment, becoming the foundation of what would evolve into a comprehensive signals intelligence network spanning the Pacific. The modified scanning receivers, refined through multiple iterations, became standard equipment at intercept stations from Alaska to Australia. Rochefort received minimal official recognition for his work. The Navy awarded him the Distinguished Service Medal in October 1942, but the citation could not mention cryptanalysis or the receiver modification. Such details remained classified at the highest levels. He was reassigned to Washington in late 1942. Partly due to bureaucratic politics within the Navy's intelligence establishment, and finished the war in training and administrative roles far from the cryptanalytic work he loved. After the war, as the history of American signals intelligence was gradually declassified, historians began recognizing the crucial role that Station HYPO had played in the Battle of Midway and the broader Pacific campaign. Rochefort was belatedly honored in the 1980s, receiving recognition for his cryptanalytic leadership, but the specific contribution of his scanning receiver modification remained obscure, buried in technical reports and classified documents that few researchers examined. Thomas Huckins, the radio man who assisted with the modification, returned to civilian life after the war and worked as an electronics technician in San Diego. In a 1979 interview with a naval historian, he described the 5 nights spent building the modified receiver. "We knew what we were doing was probably against regulations, but we also knew it was necessary." The sergeant had this ability to see what needed to be done, and to just do it, regardless of what the manual said. That modification probably contributed more to winning Midway than any single piece of tactical intelligence, because without it, we wouldn't have had the intercepts that revealed Japanese plans. The technical principles behind Rochefort's modification, automatic frequency scanning, signal-activated recording, multi-channel monitoring, became foundational concepts in signals intelligence. Modern systems perform these functions with digital processors and sophisticated algorithms, monitoring thousands of frequencies simultaneously, processing vast data streams in real time. But the underlying concept remains unchanged. To break codes, you must first intercept messages, and to intercept messages comprehensively, you must monitor continuously across all communication channels. The modified receiver that Rochefort built in May 1942 survived the war and was eventually transferred to the Naval Security Group Museum, where it was displayed briefly in the 1990s before being moved to storage. It remains there today, a tangle of hand-wired components mounted on plywood, its motorized tuning mechanism frozen by decades of inactivity, its wire recorder empty. Museum curators occasionally show it to researchers, explaining its significance in dry technical language that captures its function but not its meaning. The meaning lies not in the components but in what they represented. The moment when American signals intelligence transitioned from inadequacy to effectiveness, when the balance of cryptographic advantage shifted permanently in favor of the Allies. When a single sergeant's ingenuity solved a problem that institutional processes had failed to address. The clicking of that motorized tuning mechanism, scanning endlessly through frequencies where Japanese transmissions traveled, was the sound of American adaptability asserting itself through technical innovation and practical problem-solving. For the Japanese commanders whose plans were revealed by the intercepts that system captured, the sound would have been terrifying had they known it existed. Every transmission they sent, encrypted in codes they believed unbreakable, distributed across frequencies they assumed could not be monitored comprehensively, was being captured, recorded, and fed to American cryptanalysts who were systematically reconstructing their operational plans. The security they believed their sophisticated codes provided was an illusion, shattered not by superior Japanese codework being overcome, but by American interception capability that Japanese planners had not imagined possible. The psychological impact of this disparity extended beyond Midway. Throughout 1943 and 1944, Japanese naval forces operated with decreasing confidence, aware that American forces seemed to anticipate their moves, appeared in unexpected places, avoided traps, and executed successful ambushes with suspicious regularity. Japanese commanders attributed this to spies, to security failures, to bad luck. They could not understand that their encrypted communications were being read with high reliability, because American intercept capability had been revolutionized by a sergeant working in a basement with salvaged parts. There is a particular irony in the story of Rochefort's modification, an irony that captures something essential about warfare in the industrial age. The Japanese Navy had invested tremendous resources in developing sophisticated encryption systems, in training cipher clerks, in establishing secure communication procedures. They had done everything right according to cryptographic theory, used complex codes, changed additive tables regularly, enforced communication discipline. But they had failed to consider that their security depended not only on unbreakable codes, but on the practical impossibility of their enemy intercepting enough messages to break those codes. American cryptanalysts, conversely, had approached the problem from the opposite direction. They assumed that Japanese codes could be broken given sufficient data, and therefore focused on maximizing interception capability. Rochefort's modification was the culmination of this approach, a recognition that the constraint was not analytical capability, but data acquisition, and that data acquisition could be improved through technical innovation at the tactical level. This divergence in approaches reflected deeper philosophical differences. The Japanese emphasis on defensive security, on protecting their own communications through unbreakable codes, was characteristic of a military culture that valued perfection, secrecy, and control. The American emphasis on offensive interception, on capturing everything and trusting analysts to extract meaning, was characteristic of a culture that valued abundance, initiative, and adaptability. Both approaches were rational within their own frameworks, but the American approach proved more effective in practice because it was more forgiving of imperfection and more adaptable to unexpected circumstances. The clicking of Rochefort's scanning receiver was the sound of this philosophical difference manifesting in hardware. It was not a perfect system, it missed transmissions, suffered mechanical failures, required constant maintenance. But it was good enough, and in war, good enough delivered quickly is vastly superior to perfection delivered too late. The Japanese code might have remained unbreakable if American interception remained constrained by conventional monitoring methods. But once Rochefort removed that constraint through improvised innovation, the code's theoretical strength became irrelevant. In the decades since World War II, the methods of signals intelligence have evolved beyond recognition. Modern cryptography uses mathematical systems that are, for practical purposes, unbreakable through conventional cryptanalysis. But the fundamental lesson of Rochefort's modification remains relevant. Security depends not only on the strength of encryption, but on the totality of the communication system, including assumptions about an adversary's interception capabilities. Organizations and nations that invest heavily in encryption, while neglecting to consider how an innovative adversary might improve interception capability, are repeating the Japanese mistake of 1942. The broader lesson extends beyond cryptography to the nature of technological competition in warfare. Superior equipment matters, but adaptability and innovation often matter more. The Japanese possessed excellent equipment. Their aircraft carriers were superb, their torpedoes superior to American equivalents, their optical systems among the world's best. But they fought within a rigid institutional framework that struggled to adapt when circumstances changed. The Americans possessed adequate equipment, enormous industrial capacity, and critically an institutional culture that empowered individuals at every level to innovate, improvise and implement solutions without waiting for permission from distant authorities. Rochefort's modification was one example among thousands of this adaptive capacity. American forces throughout World War II continuously modified equipment, developed new tactics, and solved problems through field innovation. Some modifications were minor, changes to loading procedures or maintenance practices. Others were substantial, new weapons, new tactics, new operational concepts. Cumulatively, they gave American forces an adaptability that overwhelmed enemies who might win initial engagements, but who could not match the pace of American tactical and technical evolution. The sound of the clicking tuning mechanism faded into history, as the modified receivers were eventually replaced by newer equipment, as vacuum tube electronics gave way to transistors and then to digital systems, as the art of manual cryptanalysis was superseded by computer-assisted methods. But the principles that Rochefort demonstrated, that operational problems require practical solutions, that innovation can emerge from unexpected sources, that bureaucratic constraints should not prevent necessary modifications, that results matter more than procedures, these principles remain foundational to effective military operations. Joseph Rochefort died in 1976, having spent his final years in quiet retirement in California. His obituaries in major newspapers gave his cryptanalytic work during World War II only brief mention, and none mentioned the scanning receiver modification that had made much of that work possible. The story remained classified, its details scattered across technical documents and classified histories that few researchers accessed. Only in the 1990s and 2000s, as intelligence records were progressively declassified, did historians begin reconstructing the specific contributions that enabled Station HYPO's cryptanalytic success. Among those contributions, the modified receiver stands out not because it was the most complex or the most sophisticated, but because it exemplified the essential character of American innovation during the war: pragmatic, improvised, focused on solving immediate problems with available resources, contemptuous of regulations that impeded mission accomplishment. The receiver was built in 5 days using salvaged parts by a sergeant and a radioman working at night in a basement workshop. It violated equipment standards, voided warranties, and operated outside formal approval processes. It also worked, immediately and effectively, solving a critical problem that formal development channels had failed to address. This was how wars were won, not through adherence to peacetime procedures, but through the accumulated effect of thousands of practical innovations. most small and unnoticed, implemented by individuals who understood that circumstances demanded action rather than permission. Rochefort's modification was simply more consequential than most, occurring at a moment and place where improved interception capability directly enabled the intelligence victory that preceded and enabled the tactical victory at Midway. There is a recording, preserved in the National Archives, of the ambient sound in Station HYPO during the spring of 1942. It was made accidentally by a wire recorder left running during a shift change, capturing 37 minutes of the room's acoustic environment. The quality is poor, the content mostly unintelligible, fragments of conversation, typewriter noise, the background hum of ventilation and electrical equipment. But at 4:23 in the recording, clearly audible beneath the other sounds is the rhythmic clicking of a motorized tuning mechanism scanning across frequencies. The sound lasts for 11 seconds before the recording ends. Those 11 seconds of clicking, preserved by accident and unnoticed for decades, are perhaps the truest memorial to Rochefort's work. Not a medal or a monument, but a sound, mechanical, repetitive, undramatic. The sound of a problem being solved, of a constraint being removed, of capability being created through ingenuity and improvisation. The sound of American democracy at war, where a sergeant's insight could matter as much as an admiral's strategy, where innovation was valued regardless of its source, where the mission determined what was possible, rather than regulations determining what was attempted. For the cryptanalysts who worked in that room, who listened to that clicking day and night through the critical months of 1942, the sound became synonymous with hope. It meant they would have the data they needed. It meant their analytical skills could be properly employed. It meant they could provide commanders the intelligence necessary for victory. The clicking was not the sound of war in any conventional sense. No explosions, no gunfire, no drama. It was the sound of war in the industrial and information age, the sound of systems and processes, of data collection and analysis, of knowledge becoming power. And in the basement of the 14th Naval District Administration Building, in May 1942, as a modified receiver clicked its way across frequencies where Japanese transmissions traveled, that sound carried a promise that would be fulfilled 5 weeks later in the waters north of Midway Atoll. The promise that American forces would not fight blind, that Japanese plans would be revealed, that the intelligence advantage would belong to the side that had empowered a sergeant to modify a radio receiver without waiting for permission from Washington. The promise, ultimately, of victory born not from superior force alone but from superior adaptability, innovation, and the democratic faith that solutions could emerge from anywhere when circumstances demanded them. The clicking has been silent for 80 years. The receivers were scrapped or placed in storage. The men who heard that sound daily have nearly all passed. But the lesson endures, that in technological warfare, advantage belongs not necessarily to those with the best equipment, but to those who can adapt that equipment most rapidly to changing circumstances, who can empower individuals to innovate, who can implement solutions at the speed of operational necessity rather than bureaucratic comfort. This was America's advantage in 1942, hard-won through the work of men like Joseph Rochefort, who understood that rules existed to serve missions rather than missions existing to follow rules. In the end, the story of the forbidden radio modification that helped crack Japan's naval code is a story about freedom, not freedom in the abstract sense of political philosophy, but freedom in the practical sense of operational authority. The freedom for a sergeant to modify equipment when the situation demanded it. The freedom for commanders to trust subordinates' expertise. The freedom for an organization to value results over procedure. These freedoms were not unlimited or unstructured, but they were real, and they gave American forces a decisive advantage over enemies who fought within more rigid institutional frameworks. The clicking of that scanning receiver, modest and mechanical, was the sound of that freedom in operation, the sound of a problem being solved because someone was empowered to solve it, the sound of innovation occurring at the tactical level where problems were most clearly understood, the sound of American democracy, adapting to the demands of total war without sacrificing the flexibility and initiative that made democracy effective. And in the strategic balance of the Pacific War, That sound, more than any weapon or tactic, was the sound of victory becoming inevitable.